Man, like this is the best Saturday ever. I get to be with David and Maceo here talking about God, your work, your journeys, but kind of violence that we experience, our communities experience, the bodies and minds, and how it's sort of you guys distill and reconstruct this in and through art and the poetics of this Chicanx self. So David, Maceo, welcome.
Thank you, Frederick. We're excited to talk about our work.
Thank you for having us.
So you both have very different journeys, and I'm hoping that you can kind of share a little bit. We have on the one hand, Maceo, you went to kind of Yale, Columbia, got your MFA. David, you went sort of other routes with Fresno State, Cal State, Riverside, and then but also coming out finally with an MFA. Why, maybe you can share like something in your origin stories that brought you to this place of like creativity as a way to kind of add and transform the world. I said, you want to launch us here?
Yeah, I'll start. For one, I feel like my work emerged out of a Chicano activist family, and to kind of compare, mine and David's journey, right? I would, say that maybe David's experience is more similar to a lot of my students who kind of come to the classroom, having a very different kind of experience with what it means to be Chicano. So to our maybe not even heard of the term or to consider themselves Chicano, or so to grow up in a Chicano family of activists and artists, is very rare. And I grew up with this understanding that art could change the world, and that was like the role of artists. But still, like I resisted that, even though I always found ways of seeking out art-related activities, illustrations for school or campus publications. When I was in college, I had like these different travel study fellowships where my project was to do like a body of artwork, but I wanted to be a lawyer. I don't know if it was just because I was so surrounded by artists and I wanted to do something different. But I was a history and an ethnicity, race, and migration major, and I appreciated everything that I was learning, but I always had issue with kind of what you then did with it. The history papers that I would write were very dry, and so I think in the back of my mind, I was starting to think, how could I take all of this that I'm learning about, but express it in a different way. But my senior history thesis was on the debate of revolutionary art in Mexico, and in particular focusing on David Alfaro Siqueiros, one of like the big Mexican muralists, and Rufino Tamayo. And when they were in their 60s, they got in this like a fist fight. And I used that as kind of an entry into their different perspectives on art. And I think in just looking at David Alfaro Siqueiros' life, just his use of his activism. He was a soldier. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. He attempted to assassinate Trotsky. He organized miners for years, in addition to being a painter. And I was very much inspired by how he combined his activism, his being a militant activist, and his artwork. So what's funny is like here I was already surrounded by that, but I think it took seeing someone else's work to kind of get me to start thinking about a different path. And then my senior year, I painted a mural on campus, and the excitement that I felt, I didn't want to go home at the end of the day. I just wanted to keep on painting. I couldn't sleep at night. I was so excited to get out there and start painting again. And I just recognized that as being this very unique experience, and one that I felt like I should follow. And I really feel like everything kind of stemmed from there as I started to pursue the ways that I could be, involved politically, to be an activist, to have my work matter, and how to do that as an artist.
David.
So it's quite the opposite, just kind of like Marcel was talking about. It's more similar to the journey of many of his students and many of my students now, right? Where when I first even had the inclination that maybe I was bored and not necessarily in the direction that I wanted to really be in, is when I was kicked out of a high school in which I went to a magnet school where I have chosen like business, because I thought, business is what I need to do and what I need to do in order to succeed, in order to build my family up and get us out. And so when I was bored, and so I acted up, I was kicked out. I went to my home school, Fresno High, and there I was exposed to competitive speech and debate. Because I needed extra credits because I had messed up so much. And the kind teacher there was just an amazing and inspiration, and allowed my creativity to flourish, so much so that that's where I began to write. And I began to see myself as a potential writer. And so when I went over to Fresno City College, where I now teach full-time at, I took a class a few years in thinking I want to be a high school English teacher, just like my forensics teacher. And my last semester there, before I transferred out, I took a poetry class with Lee Herrick. And the first book that I was assigned was Andrés Montoya's The Ice Worker Sings and Other Poems. And from that moment, I was just like, whoa, somebody who likes to write can write a book. And he looks like me, because I turned it to the back, and I was just like, this is kind of wild. This is amazing. This is something I want to do. And so when I transferred over to Fresno State, I pursued that interest. I started getting involved in the community through that class. It just opened up so many doors that I met a few folks, co-started a local radio show through our KPFA affiliate here in Fresno, 88.1 FM, KFCF, right? And we ran a show called Pacatelas for a few years. And we interviewed writers and artists from across the nation. That was a huge exposure to me, and like it benefited hopefully the community, but also it really benefited me in the long term. But just like being exposed to all these different stories and all these different potentials of what art can do for you, and I was just like, this is amazing. Along that path, right, I was exposed to Juan Felipe Herrera, who would then later become the first Chicano U.S. Poet Laureate. And somebody told me, I asked if I were to go get an MFA somewhere, where would you go get it? And they're just like, Juan Felipe Herrera. This was even before, all those accolades had come in. Teaches at UC Riverside. You should go study with him. And I was like, all right, cool. So I applied to all these different MFAs. I ultimately went to the one where he was at, and at UC Riverside, and had an amazing journey coming out from that. So much so, by the time that I finished, I had already completed the book that was eventually going to win the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize, Furious Dusk. So by my second year, I was already continuing and pushing the work even further. So when I came back, I wanted to, continue to serve my community. I came back to teach at Fresno City, eventually got a full-time job. And in the meantime, I started to communicate with Marcel through, I think it was through Francisco Aragon, who just like pushed us together. And we started to generate the work that we've collaborated on today.
David, I can just add to your story. What's so amazing is the fact that, from your kind of revelation when you were in that poetry workshop in junior college to transferring to Fresno State to getting your MFA to winning the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize. It all happened in less than 5 years, right? If I'm correct.
What was it? I went in 2014. I started, that class was in 2007.
2007.
So
Okay.
2007, at the late fall 2007. So about like 7 years between like, poetry and winning a prize.
Right? Yeah.
I love it too, the way you guys shared the kind of separate journeys, but then how key figures, brought you together, or maybe more sharply speaking here, how creation became a space of collaboration. I love it. So amazing, both of you. And so, David, let me ask you while I've got you here, like, why? I mean, you've talked about the journey. You've kind of found the kind of groove. You were thinking about, a completely different path in life, but you found fiction. You found your way to fiction and painting, murals, art, etc. Was there like a light bulb moment? Was it like, how did this happen? Yeah.
Frederick, I thought maybe this question was for me, the fiction, painting, art, and the images to the left, or was it for David? You write fiction too?
I don't write fiction. I try to sometimes, but go ahead, Marcel. I think go ahead.
Frederick, was that right? Oh, okay, all right. Well, I think my primary interest was telling stories, and I think that my early work was very much like derivatives of my dad's or my uncle's or my brother's, and so in my own voice as a visual artist, I found it through literature. And I saw my murals as stories. They were in a way that when I was dissatisfied with how, like a history essay, like through a mural, you're telling a certain history, right? And I wanted to tell history in that way. But then, I found like I was less comfortable telling like the broad strokes of history, and I wanted to tell more intimate stories. And so when I right after graduating from college, I had this idea that I just wanted to find a small town similar to one that I grew up in, and I wanted to rent a room, and I wanted to teach myself how to paint. And it was in this small town that I came across, the undocumented field workers. I played soccer with them. They became my friends, and I started writing. I started painting stories about their lives. But I wanted more. There was these details through conversations that were shared with me that I wanted to find a way to bring into my work. And I still felt kind of uncomfortable, telling stories so directly about these friends that I came to know. And so that's when I began to fictionalize their stories and to get really excited about inventing stories of my own, that I would just pull a detail from here, pull a detail from there, and it would make, it would form a painting, and then I would try and write a story that would go along with it. And so all of it kind of happened at all at the same time in that year that I spent in Knights Landing, where I saw that a painting is a story, a painting is a poem, a painting is one way of kind of expressing these details, but that I also wanted to include my own writing, and find another way of sharing those details with the viewer, with the reader. And eventually my fiction kind of went its own direction, my painting went its own direction, but I've continuously sought ways of bringing them together, and one of them has been collaborating with other writers and poets like David, Laureate, Guerrero in these visual textual projects.
Yeah, Maceo, sorry about that. Here I am, like, I'm trying to get David to ventriloquize your experience, right?
Which would have been amazing. I kind of wanted to hear that.
Yeah, let's switch like musical chairs here. So, okay, David, why poetry?
Ooh, I think, I have different answers, right, for this specific question. And I noticed that every time I answer this, it continues evolving. I switch perspectives. I'm over here one day, like, why poetry? Because it saves my life. Why poetry? Because it can transform community. Why poetry? Because I am inattentive and can't do long form, right? And so I think it is the best representation of my experience and my level of focus. Like, one, I'm known for being a bit inattentive. And so if it doesn't like spark some kind of hard obsessive quality, then I can't really stay engaged with something for way too long. And the one thing that I found, time and time again, that really evokes that level of obsession and engagement is poems. And I found myself that I could read poetry for extended periods of time. I could write and edit poetry for extended periods of time where, there's that huge kind of cliche moment where you disappear into the work and you like look up and hours have passed, right? And I found that to be true with this, and I was just like, okay, right, this is something that I love and that I have a passion for, but ultimately at the end of the day, the larger thing that I wanted to do with poetry was write to myself. And so, for example, Furious Dusk was written specifically for my high school self, right? I wanted the high school version of me to read this, to understand the transformation that was to come, and to kind of further contextualize what the culture and those pressures of what it means to be a man exist, then, and how they would transform me, right, and many others going through that similar process through that. So I think poetry in the larger context is to say you're not alone, right? And to give folks and readers an opportunity to enter a larger community. I think that for me has always been the long-term goal, right? To like, hey, you're not alone, welcome, right? Hey, you're not alone, welcome. Hey, you're not alone, welcome. And I think that's a good place where you can start to have those different conversations about where to go from there. And I think this book, and I was having a conversation with another poet recently, and I was really considering the new book, American Quasar, and how that fit within, in terms of context, with Furious Dusk. And I was just like, it seems like an extension of that conversation, just in a different time period, right? And I was just like, oh, so I haven't really finished that idea yet, right? Like that idea has yet to be completed. And so I'm wondering, is this the completion of the idea, or do I have another one in me, and where I continue to push that idea even further? And I think that's why poetry excites me. It's because you begin to see these larger conversations happening to other communities, inside other communities that are smaller, bigger, whatever have you.
David, let me ask you on this sort of idea of you are not alone, and the kind of the openness to, everybody, the inclusivity of your poetics. Do you, when you write, do you like, is this, the writing, is this a kind of almost oral transcript, something that you know is going to be kind of read aloud, or what's that process? And then that will kind of get us nicely into as well our talk about how you've created new forms of poetry.
So I wanted the first one to be accessible, meaning I did not necessarily want folks to be so challenged by the language that they felt excluded. And I think that was a big thing for me. Like, I was in the middle of graduate school taking seminars, right, where I was having to juggle and really understand different levels of jargon, right, academic jargon. And I was just like, I don't want this experience for my readers. I don't want that experience for 16-year-old me. Couldn't handle that. So one way that I wanted to make sure that 16-year-old me would have access to it was by approaching it using language that was accessible to him. And that was a very specific choice. Now, moving forward, right, I began to, one, challenge myself. How can I make that still accessible, but also challenging for different readers? And this is, I think, one of the aspects that I began to think about when I was writing what eventually came to be our collaboration, because I was thinking, okay, like, and Marcel, you can acknowledge this, those first few drafts were kind of wild, right? They were just like really long poems that sometimes went all over and in many different ways, because I was trying to push and I was trying to figure out where that was going. I don't know.
Yeah, so you also do these video poems,
Yeah.
David. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about those?
Those came about because I was taking a lot of screenwriting courses, and I noticed that the way that I structured my first book, the structure of that comes from, if you are familiar with screenwriting, you're familiar with the big textbook Story, right? Or Save the Cat. And in them, they have certain beats that you have to meet at, like, minute 10, the dead body, right? Or the inside, right? Like all these different moments that you would encounter in, that larger narrative theory of how to create a story. And so it was just like, if you look at Furious Dusk, you can see all those moments, right? That's how they became structured. And so one of the things that I really loved within, that was, hey, a poem is a beat. There's a specific turn. And I was just like, wait, isn't that what happens in poetry, right? And so it was just like, can I find a way to make a poem that exists on the page also exist visually? And so this is where I started to push myself, with the limited gear that I had and the limited production quality that I had, and say, can I create visual representations of those beats? Can I push that even further? And I think this is one of the main reasons why I really like this collaboration process, because it's almost like an extension of that, right?
Love that. Okay, yeah, let's talk about this co-creation, American Quasar. And I know like kind of deep down, you guys and your, like, everything you do, even the kind of breathing and the all actions and thoughts are to intervene and make a better place for this world that we live in. But tell me about this one in particular and how you see it as possibly intervening in maybe other ways, and then let's get into this kind of co-creation sort of space of process. Dave Maceo, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, well, I think that the work came about. We wanted to collaborate somehow, and we were throwing some ideas around that appealed to us both. And I can't remember, David, maybe you can refresh my memory. There was something about the violence and the body and
it was one line. We were just charged to create one image and one poem together, and I think both of us chose "On the Precipice of Violence," and we were just like, "Oh, and let's start from that specific line," and we went from there.
And I think less the violence and more this idea of the precipice is something that both poets and visual artists, their method, their process kind of work towards. You can kind of throw language onto the page, or you can kind of throw the paint or the imagery onto the page, and then but you're searching for this moment, and whether it's by adding or reducing or editing or changing a word, you're kind of you're pushing your work towards this edge, right? And you might be uncertain what that feeling that you're looking for, right? But that's what can be so powerful and exciting about the process, I think, of both poetry and visual art is it's that search, right? How can I push this to the very edge? And when it comes to how our work can kind of intervene and transform the world, I think that there was two artists trying to understand each other's sensibilities and trying to often within the book, but then also how we've talked about it is the work is kind of an excavation of self, right? And that's what we as human beings do on a daily basis, or in a way we should be doing, this kind of excavation of self. How can we kind of better understand who it is that we are and how we operate in the world, and that kind of brutal honesty, which it wasn't like we were articulating this. It was like we were feeling this through the process, right? This excavation of who we are, and whether it was through violence, through shame, through the weight, the burdens that we carry as men, as Chicanos, as human beings, all of that, like we were less kind of consciously aware of, and it was more of this like this burst of energy. And David, I don't see those early drafts as being out there. I see them as being full of energy and excitement, and that's what I fed off of as an artist, was pulling from just the images that you were kind of expelling, and I think the same thing, right? Every image that I would send back to you would spur you to write 5 more poems. And Frederick, that's how it was for a couple of weeks. It was like I would take a line from David's poetry and come up with an image and send it to, I would come up with 5 images and then send it to him, and he would come back at me with 10 poems. And this idea that we're like feeding off of each other and are attempting to kind of come to terms with what was the sensibility that we kind of understood about one another. It was transformative for ourselves, and I feel like there's something about that process that I hope is conveyed and also feels transformative for the readers and viewers of this work.
Yeah, David.
He hit it out of the park with that one, right? Like we were feeding off of this energy, right? And so it was, I would send him, 10 pages of work. He would send me 5 to 10 images, and it was going back and forth, right? And it was just like this burst of creative process. And this is probably one of the main reasons that I decided to go with this kind of like larger image of a quasar, right? In which you have essentially, a supermassive black. You hear my dogs in the background. Hold on for 1 minute. This is where we're at, right, in our world. And so it was that intense kind of level of energy that I wanted to recreate and have folks understand, right? And by putting it within that larger context. Maceo briefly or talked about like this larger excavation of self. And not only did I want to have that excavation of self, like the personal self, but also how we exist within the larger world, right? And I think for me, the question that was burning in my mind at that particular moment was, how do I exist? How do I exist and appreciate and love myself, right, in this world that doesn't necessarily love me or appreciate me? Right. And I think that was that larger question, right? Like on the precipice. And I was on the precipice of trying to figure that out for myself, and kept pushing that in order to find out what that answer was for me. And I think we got close to it, hopefully, in this project.
Let me ask you guys this. Did you already have a publisher signed? Or did you guys just like, we're going to go for it and make this really like incredible, thing, and then get someone to publish it?
No, far from it. Francisco Aragon had talked to us about maybe doing this print. Like we would collaborate on a print that we could then sell and raise money for the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize. So we started there. But I think when we started trading back and forth, images for poetry and David, I actually went through our emails and I found one where it was like, I suggested, I said, I think we have a book here. And then we moved forward and we kept on kind of developing. There's maybe 30 of these monoprints. And I'm sure, David, you have 100+ pages of poetry. And it was very rough at first how we brought it together. I don't think we were very our intent behind, okay, how do we take all of this burst of energy and then make it into a cohesive work? That took time. And I want to, my hat off to David. He took his time and he got feedback and really worked through, these poems, and then how the poems and the artwork would work together. And so I almost had the easy part. And, not that the process of making art is easy, but it's I don't know. In my understanding of my work as a visual artist and my work as a writer, is that the visual art is much more physical and much more like kind of comes from the gut, and it is that burst of energy, right? That you feed off of, and then when it's gone, it's gone, right? Whereas, for David's process, what I learned in kind of watching him is that, there's that initial burst of energy, but then there's the intense labor, years-long labor of kind of honing that work and shaping it to make it what it needs to be. And so it was maybe a year or two later where we were actually talking about, all right, who are we going to reach out to? And it's a different kind of work, and not everyone is willing to take a chance with the costs or extra design that, a visual textual work will entail. And so, we sent it out, and, thankfully Red Hen Press was interested.
So amazing. So we've been talking around this and directly about this violence, excavation of self, the precipice, the edge, but there's also family, familia, and the social and the nation. And finally, really like the end of of the book in this sort of remarkable way, love, right? And not love in a kind of cheap and sentimental way, but in a kind of as a gift. And I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about, some of these really important themes, these important imagery, feelings that we take away from, that move us so deeply.
I'll let David talk about this more, but just if, talk the precipice of violence, we were creating this work 2016, I mean, and if that wasn't like a year that was like the precipice of like the violence to come, right? The harm that we as a nation or our political beings, it was that time that I think that, we weren't thinking of so directly, but that became kind of an integral part of the work. And then also the fact that the original title of the manuscript was American House Fire. And I mean, the last 4 years have been an American house fire. But, David, I think you can speak more to just the way that these language and ideas kind of shaped, kind of came together.
Well, at first, this poem opens the entire book, right? American House Fire. And it came across from two different images. Like most folks, you have multiple tabs open in a browser. And I was watching a TED Talk in one, and in the other, I was, browsing the news. And I was listening to this one TED Talk where this person talks about how even the blind in victory will raise their hands up in the air, right? And I was just like, oh, that's interesting, right? And then I clicked on the other tab, and you see these protests and these folks just walking up, like hands up in the air towards the police with their firearms raised. And I'm just like, wait, is this victory or surrender? Like, what's going on here? And when we were thinking about the precipice of violence, I'm just like, that, but that image to me is in itself like very conflicting and almost contradictory, and a place where you can jump off in many different directions. And so that's kind of what started this larger idea for me, in the way that now this poem came a bit later in the generating process. But I identified this one as, okay, this is the poem that needs to start it for the entire narrative that I was trying to build to make sense, and in collaboration with those images, because I wanted to make sure that we started with the sense of, is this victory or is this surrender, or what does this look like? So by the time that you reach the end and you go through nation, you go through family, you go through all these different incidents of violence, that you really understand that the perception, or at least the way that I created this narrative, was that the perception of all of those things only matters to the person at the very core, at the very center. So, like, can you love yourself, right? And from that, I think that is enough. And so when he realizes that near the end, I think this is, and how he comes to realize that is in itself a journey, I think, that I won't necessarily spoil for a lot of folks.
No, it's beautifully articulated. Thanks, David. Yeah, this also sort of this idea of, victory, surrender. Well, it really depends on your sense of status of belonging too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So deeply. You've both already begun to talk about this process, and this also process that's deeply co-creative. I love that, because so often, where we have two artists working together, they're not. Like, a publisher puts the artist illustrator to, says, you do this, and you writer do this, and then the publisher puts things together. But you guys, it really feels like an integral whole. Is there something here in something like The Color of Faith that you'd like to share with us, David, in terms of, just kind of almost mechanics and shaping, like, the power of the line break, and then finally how this kind of works in conversation with the art Maceo, and vice versa, not as illustration, but as a way to kind of go beyond even the words that are presented to us on the page. David.
I'll let you. Oh, okay, I'll start. So with the line break, so one thing that I've been doing a lot, or at least making sure that specifically pay attention to is the way that when some folks read, right, they don't read word for word, they read segments, they read an entire line, right? They absorb that line visually. And so the one thing that I was trying to do with the line breaks is also make sure that even grammatically you could flip it and see that line in a different way. So for example, that second line, alcohol, yesterday morning, alcohol dripped, can also be interpreted as alcohol dripped yesterday morning. At the end of the poem, give all of yourself when I say it, could also be when I say it, give all of yourself, right? And making sure, like, sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't work as well as I would like for it to work, but I wanted those lines to work in multiple ways. And it also gives me as a writer a different way to think about that specific line, to say, would it work better if I said alcohol dripped yesterday morning, right? And so I don't want to end on a word that is just morning, right? That's kind of a basic word. But dripped, that adds sound, that adds an image, right? And now you're beginning to think of this specific line of something differently. And so you begin to look at the words that you end on: church, dripped, sweat, shoulder, sun, love, right? These are the words that I want the reader to kind of leave with, right? When they're just looking at something else. So these are the types of things that I'm looking for in my line breaks, and the way that I arrange lines, in order to make sure that whatever the central thesis of a specific poem is, that I'm manipulating the language in order to achieve that. And if I didn't achieve that, then I have failed, right? And so this is one of the things that I wanted to make sure I was concrete in. So for example, I mean, the last word in the first line is church, and the last word in the entire poem is pray, right? Right. That line ends church, pray. And so I wanted to also have that kind of bookend in a way. These words mirror each other and are in relationship to one another in a way that already is significant in a reader's mind. And I wanted to make sure that was emphasized here.
Wow, beautiful. I just learned so much there. Maceo, how do you mind taking over here?
Yeah. So, you're right that, usually when image and word are combined, right, it's not necessarily, the process of bringing them together isn't always organic, right? I think it's often, taking one entity and bringing it with another. I also think that our understanding of how image and text work is that the image should be this kind of one-to-one kind of representation of what's in the text, right? So that the image is in service of the text. And there's something very satisfying about that. If you think about, a children's book, you're reading the story and then you turn to the image and you get to see what that looks like. But it's trained us in a way to expect that all right, what's in the poem or what's in the word or in the text is going to then be kind of literally translated into the image. And that I've worked on projects like that, and I've found that it's not satisfying as an artist. You want to be able to kind of follow your own process, your own line breaks in a way to take the poetry, the language of poetry. And so in this case, with this series, they're all monoprints, and which I would ink up a plate, right? So it would be completely covered with the black ink, and then I would wipe away or dig, and I would use a rag, I'd use a pencil, I'd use like any tool that I could find in order to kind of create the effect that I was looking for. And then you get to a point and you just leave it, and because you run it through the etching press, you have no idea what it's going to look like on the other side. Sometimes, the weight will be too heavy and also blur the image, or it's an experiment every time, and so you don't know what it's going to look like on the page, and that's part of the excitement of the process. But I think that, in thinking about the one-to-one relationship, if I were to like illustrate this poem, right, I would say, okay, I understand what it means to pray, and I would have a man praying, but I feel in my process, right, I was looking at this idea of love, of desperation, of faith, of all of these different images that pop up in David's poem, and I wanted to try and capture that, right? So yes, it does depict a man praying, and yet there is all of this kind of like emotional kind of construction that goes into the image that it's my hope that that's conveyed.
Right. And also the very process of extraction and excavation, right? And of course, the theme of kind of excavation and extraction of the self or selves. You both, of course, are teachers and, working in different spaces with students and so on. Could you share a kind of trademark method for bringing this into our community's art as kind of transformative? David, do you want to jump us in here?
Yeah, I teach at a community college, so I get them first before all of you do, right? And so one of the first things that I think I really try to expose them is to the variety of different voices that look like them. And I know that, that seems to be one of the keystones for, this is how you begin to build equity and diversity in the classroom. But that is definitely one of the things that I think a lot of students aren't necessarily exposed to. I mean, why is it that it took me into my last semester of community college to find out that there was a poet who looked like me, who wrote a book that won awards, right? Like, why did it take that long, right? And I want to make it sure and make it known that that's not necessarily the case. So, for example, one of the things that I do within my classroom, especially within my critical thinking classrooms, is I ask them to compile and, as a class project, all the work, all the poets, all the fiction writers, all the nonfiction writers, all the journalists, all the artists, right, into a Google spreadsheet for themselves for that class. So they are themselves discovering who Juan Felipe Herrera is, right, Sandra Cisneros, right, like all these different like larger generational artists that most of us are now familiar with, but for them, this is their first time, right, and they are being exposed to that. And I want them to have that moment of discovery. Because to be told something is one thing, but to discover something for yourself, right, is completely transformative. And I think I wanted to mimic that experience for my students. And so I signed, hey, go discover one of these writers, read a short story of them, and then report back, right, within that spreadsheet to the larger class. And so they are exposing themselves over the course of that semester to different writers, different artists, different people within this larger Latinx and Chicanx community, which they themselves can then be like, that's interesting. I want to know more about that. And that's where it starts for me in my class.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Maceo.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to David, my students are for the most part, Chicanx, Latinx, first generation. They come from the Central Valley. They come from Los Angeles, mostly from working class backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds, and it's transformative just for these students to learn that they come from this rich history, this rich culture, and to be exposed to writers and artists who who look like them, who have last names like them, who are telling stories that are similar to stories that they've experienced. And to see that, there are writers talking about their lives 40, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that they're not the first one to kind of experience this. And that's very, very powerful. I also, I make an attempt to tell them that their stories matter. So it's not just about kind of critiquing this work or analyzing this work, but to actually attempt their own. And so any form that we're reading or learning about, I make it a point to have an assignment where they're also attempting their own. So we learn about corridos, and they write their own songs, the stories that they want to tell. We learn about actos, the teatro campesino plays, and they write their own acto, but about a contemporary issue that they want to address. We look at the different variations of like personal manifestos or outright manifestos that were written in the Chicano movement, and I have them create their own kind of personal testimony manifesto. And I think that it's the work that's probably most important that emerges out of this class, is in which they're given this opportunity to tell their own story and to do it within this larger history and tradition. And similar to David's experience, I have students who take my class as like a requirement at the end of their 4 years. And so they have made it all the way through their elementary, high school, junior college education without taking a class like this. And so they almost feel this frustration or anger that they've been deprived of this history. And, it points to kind of the problems and issues of our educational system, that it's only by the time they get to college and happen to take my class or David's class, that they're exposed to something that is so fundamental to who we are. I mean, it's art and culture. I mean, all of this is like, it's made me who I am, right? And David, I think, can say the same thing. And to think that you can make it through your life and not be exposed to it, it makes me feel like the work that we do is why it's so important.
It is so important. And, earlier on in our conversations, you both talked about, figures that had, big inspirations for you. Siqueiros, Andrés, your uncle, right, Maceo, for David. Do you want to, and of course, Juan, Felipe, and others, inspirations past and present. Maceo, do you want to launch us on this one?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because, again, growing up with all of these figures, right? So my uncle Jose Montoya, my dad Malaquias, my cousin Richard of Culture Clash, my brother Andres, and then all of their influences and friends, and Juan Felipe, I've known him since I was a little kid. All of these different Judy Vaca and Esther Hernandez and these kind of these luminaries who were part of my family, my artistic family, that they formed my sensibilities as an artist, undoubtedly. But I think that's the thing, is like I then had the freedom to go and explore and see like the artists and writers out there, completely separate from this cultural history, right? And so when I think about the novelists who had an impact on me, the Russian novelists, the Latin American boom writers, different kind of humorous, idiosyncratic writers like Italo Zevo or Thomas Bernhard, or I never get to talk about these figures in my classes, but yet those are the works that like I turn to when I think about the prose that I want to write, or the way that I want to tell these different stories. But this last year, I taught a graduate workshop in the creative writing program, and it was about political writings. And I used the work of Eduardo Galeano and his mix of poetry and prose and journalism, and how to kind of maintain, one's faith in humanity and love for humanity in the face of violence and repression. And I found, my almost 40-year-old self just as inspired by his work as my 20-year-old self. The influences are vast, and yet, I think I come back to some of the same writers and artists and their vision of what art can do in the world.
David.
I really like the way that you just phrased that, right? Like you're always kind of like a pendulum going back and forth between what really inspired you and what's currently inspiring you. Like, for example, what's currently inspiring me right now is the way that poetics is being constantly pushed forward, right? I mean, you look at the work of Anthony Cody, who his book Borderland Apocrypha was just like mind-blowing in the way that it was presented on the page, right? Its use of images, the way it's structured, the way the form is experimenting, the way it was just like using both English and Spanish in order to create the work. You look at work like Joseph Rios, right? Who's just like, screw with your traditional ways of thinking about poetry. I'm going to present it in a type of language, in a type of form that is exactly from what I know, and that is the poem that you're going to get. And Sarah Borjas, right, who goes between the traditional and pushes with different forms and ideas and talks about these larger different conflicts and complexities within the communities, right, that they exist in. And watching those works and watching those writers and reading them like really inspires me, because I was like, okay, this is what is possible. And just like them, right, they too have read probably some of the writers that I have read in the past, and I go back and I read those poets and I think about, okay, what was Juan Felipe doing, right? What was Lorna Di Cervantes doing, right? How were they pushing the envelope, right, in those contexts, and studying the way that all these other writers then continue to push the envelope so that I can too enter that ongoing conversation in a way that is meaningful, not only to myself, but to readers. And I think I find the most inspiration when I find and I'm able to identify that conversation and how it's happening in the past. And every time that I revisit a text, I'm just like, okay, I didn't spot this conversation, but now I spot this conversation because I've read more, right? And I think this is a kind of larger lesson to anybody watching this, is right. It's just like when you return to even like an old movie or something else, right? You learn something differently because you've watched more movies, right? You've learned something differently because you've watched or you've read more books, right? And that's where I think I'm getting that most amount of inspiration from in this moment.
I love it. You both have been so inspiring, and thank you for inviting me and the viewers and listeners into this incredible space of co-creation that you both have put into the world. Thank you, David. Thank you, Maceo.
Thank you
for having us.
Yeah, we're excited.